All right, it's six o'clock. So welcome to the Gender Sound Sessions at ESMUC. Today on our second session, we are very, very proud to present Professor Sherrie Tucker from the University of Kansas and present her talk. Maybe more than a talk, it's going to be a masterclass. listening to the changes, historical perspectives on jazz, race, and gender justice. Dr. Tucker, she's professor in American Studies at the University of Kansas and the author of Dance Floor Democracy, The Social Geography of Memory at the Hollywood Canteen, Swing Shift, All-Girl Bands from the 1940s, and she's a co-editor of Big Ears, Listening for Gender in Jazz Studies with Nichole, Rustin, a book containing a variety of important approaches towards research in gender and jazz studies that has very much influenced our gender sound seminars. Dr. Tucker, she's currently serving on the editorial collective of the book Improvising Across Abilities, Pauline, Oliveros, and the Adaptive Use Musical Instrument. She's also co-editor of American Studies with Randal, Jelks, and she's a series editor of Music Culture at Wesleyan University Press with Deborah Wong and Jeremy Wallach. On today's session, Dr. Tucker, she will share her current thinking on how feminist jazz historians would look at jazz without patriarchy, how to dismantle the systems of oppression, what methods, archive, approaches, potential case studies could help us to listen to these changes and bring social and cultural transformation with the creation of new jazz cultures, practices, and music. It is a privilege to have you here, Dr. Tucker, today. Thank you all the participants too, and we remind you that afterwards will be questions and answers for everybody. Welcome, Sherrie.
Thank you so much. It's really, well, I want to thank ESMUC for the amazing Gender and Sound seminar series, and especially to Angels. And I wanted to say before I start, what a privilege it is for me to be included on this program. I'm thrilled to be here. So today let me get my, I think this is correct. Is this my screen? Let's give it a try. We were there a minute ago. That looks like my screen. Okay. So today I'm going to share with you some work that's really in progress, and I'm slow, so it's work that you may have heard before that is still in progress, and I thank you for your patience as I continue to work out some questions that are important to me and I think are pertinent not only for researching gender and jazz studies, but any gender and popular music or music studies. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes and then or less. And then I'd love to hear your questions, your answers, your ideas, your thoughts on how to listen to the changes in the jazz past or in the music past in the areas of your interests, guided by the principles that I'm going to be working with today from the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice. So by changes, it's kind of a pun. And for those of you familiar with jazz, we talk about, or maybe, in other musics that use a lead sheet, we talk about playing the changes, how you navigate the chord changes when you're playing. And a lot of times, I and others have also used that as a metaphor for thinking about how performers and listeners play the changes of the parameters of our social systems, our societies. So this paper is called Listening to the Changes, Historical Perspectives on Jazz, Race, and Gender Justice. For much of my career, I have worked in a field that I would call feminist jazz studies, with a focus on women jazz instrumentalists. I have scoured the archives for traces of both the living and the dead, and I've interviewed people, but these activities alone do not make my work feminist. I consider the feminist part to be an analytic of power, And I want to do more than just fill the gaps. I don't want to just add the women. I want to do justice. Okay. This is intersectional work, and not just in terms of checking off the boxes, gender, race, class, sexuality, etc., and being complete, because it's never complete. And once I think it's complete, I'm sunk in terms of so doing justice. And I know that if I'm not attentive, the reason that it's intersectional is because if I'm not attentive to the intersections of race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, nation, empire, capitalism, politics, religion, on and on and on, as well as gender, I risk leaving out the least powerful and most marginalized people, and also the most critical analytics of power. It's possible to do feminist jazz studies without focusing on women instrumentalists, and it's also possible to focus on women jazz musicians without doing feminist jazz studies. So I want to do both. But I often feel that while I think I'm doing justice, what I'm really doing is inclusion, and the analytic of power falls out. So for the past 5 years, I have been following the ground-shifting work of Terry Lynn Carrington and Asia Burrell Wood at the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice at Berklee College of Music, not only because I hope for a different future, but because I believe that what they're doing there in that institute offers a new model for producing meaningful studies of the jazz past. When asked about the title of the institute, Jazz and Gender Justice, by my brilliant my co-editor of Big Ears, Nichole T. Rustin Paschal at the Feminist Theory and Music Conference of 2019, Terry Lynn Carrington, she asked, I don't know if I lost the beginning of the sentence in there somewhere, so I'm going to repeat it. Nichole Rustin asked Terry Lynn Carrington why she was using the term gender justice as opposed to, say, something like gender equity. And Terry Lynn Carrington said that she got that language from Angela Davis, a member of the board of the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice, which is an illustrious Black feminist advisory board. And Angela Davis explained that framing like jazz and gender equity would not get at the conditions that produced the inequity. So inclusion isn't enough. Justice would get at the root. So she named it Jazz and Gender Justice. This inspires me. I know that gender equity is not what I want in the feminist jazz archive or a feminist jazz narrative strategy. I don't want equal linear feet of archival materials or musician names in the index. At least I don't just want that. I want the archives and narratives that get at the conditions that produce the differences in who speaks and who is heard. And so I want to repurpose the weight of those missing linear footprints that I always notice when I go into an archive, and the missing names. And I want that work to challenge our ideas of what jazz sounds like and affects the ways that we listen. If adding in women and gender to the existing archive or narrative does not get at the conditions that produce the inequity, then how does one go about pursuing jazz and gender justice as a feminist jazz scholar who researches women musicians of the past? The Institute's question, what would jazz sound like in a culture without patriarchy, which is all over the website. It's twice, in fact, on this one page of the website. That is a very different kind of question than the questions that I had been accustomed to using. Those questions that I typically was using were things like, where are the women? Looking at the history, instead of presuming that women are absent because they weren't there, I say, where are the women? It's a good feminist historiography question, right? Or how does gender shape jazz discourse? So even looking at a masculinist narrative, I could say, how does gender shape this? as a future-directed orientation geared toward creating new jazz cultures, practices, and music that dismantle systems of oppression and yield new sets of changes with transformative social and cultural ripple effects, the framework of jazz and gender justice is most actively sounding changes in contemporary jazz music making, education, listening, and study, but it's also sounding changes in feminist jazz studies. I'm not the only one who's being invigorated by this. In her new work on jazz education, Tracy McMullen has been studying the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice as, quote, rooted in a long lineage of African-American practices and traditions that put collaboration, care, and justice at the center, at the heart of jazz. What is new with the Institute, argues McMullen, is, quote, the positioning of this value system within an influential post-secondary jazz program. In her exciting forthcoming article in Jazz Culture, Nichole T. Rustin Paschal draws on the Institute in positing a jazz feminist theory. Jazz feminist, I have in quotes because it is Nichole's term. Jazz, she's interested in a jazz feminist theory, praxis, and vantage point as a particular formation of Black feminisms and distinct from feminist jazz studies. And she draws from this institute as part of the model that she's developing. So if you haven't taken a look at this website, I would say that even if jazz is not what you are interested in and not what you study, it's worth taking a look at. At the Institute for Jazz and Gender Justice, jazz without patriarchy isn't just jazz with women in it. It is jazz that welcomes people, quote, of all gender and sexual identities to achieve the goal of true gender diversity in the field, unquote. And because patriarchy is about power, the answer to what would jazz without patriarchy sound like is not exactly the same, only with all genders doing it. There's a hope, there's a belief that that the music would be different in that kind of in a culture without patriarchy. So it must be responsive, that this kind of a culture must be responsive to all forms of hierarchy as Black feminist theory and praxis demands. Jazz without patriarchy isn't the same as jazz with diversity. It is jazz without white supremacy, jazz without sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, imperialism, war. It's aspirational, it compels, it helps us to imagine different jazz futures, helps us to work toward them. It might get us to something akin to political theorist Social Bickford's model for democratic listening. And she's not a music scholar, she's talking about political listening. And Bickford's model for democratic listening is one in which everyone listens and everyone is heard, where no one has less control than anyone else, and no one is more liable to being distorted to anybody else. I see this in the mission statement. So here's the mission statement of mission, values, and vision. I'm just going to read the first and last sentences of the mission statement because I think they're very interesting. So to begin with, the mission of the Berklee Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice is to recruit, teach, mentor, and advocate for musicians seeking to study jazz with gender justice and racial justice as guiding principles. And they really do that. I mean, I think a lot of music, performance programs sort of see the social justice, an interest in social justice as maybe a good thing, but as an elective, not something that the program would require or integrate into the other requirements. So this is a conservatory performance program, but it also involves readings and rap sessions. I recently was a guest at a rap session at the Institute where talking about social justice is very much integrated into the everything else that is done. And then the last sentence I wanted to say, quote, we seek to engage ourselves and others in the pursuit of jazz without patriarchy and in making a long-lasting cultural shift in jazz and other music communities, recognize the role that jazz can play in the larger struggle for gender and racial justice, unquote. So I want to just observe that this is not a diversity statement. It kind of looks like it's going to be a diversity statement, but it is not the kind of statement that has been studied by Sarah Ahmed as non-performative anti-racism, the statement that says we are committed to diversity, so we don't have a problem, and then that's the end of it. Jazz without patriarchy is not the same as that kind of a commitment to take care of a problem. It does not aspire to diversity as variety to prove we don't have a problem, but rather fosters new cohorts of jazz musicians committed to transformative justice and challenges feminist jazz scholars to rethink our methods. So it's proactive, it's reflexive, it compels work. So a moment ago, I cited someone I like very much, Susan Bickford, from her book, and this is this slide is a visual bibliographic reference in case you do not know this book and you're interested. It's a political treatise on dissonance, the dissonance of democracy, listening, conflict, and citizenship, and she writes somewhere in that book, I did not provide a page number, the riskiness of listening comes partly from the possibility that what we hear will require change from us. So listening is not passive. So what does this paradigm shift demand of me as a feminist jazz studies scholar of the jazz past? I am more accustomed to asking others to change how they listen to jazz history. How does listening to the guiding principles of jazz and gender justice require change from me? What kind of change? Mind you, after 30 years of writing about women in jazz while resisting the thankless paradigm of women in jazz that's always counting women out of jazz, even as it purports to count them in, I'm ready for change. So I'm heeding that call in the moment. And in case I said that that went by too quickly, I just want to say, I mean, sometimes I say things quickly because I feel like I've said it's something I've been grappling with so long that a shorthand will suffice. But I'll just say that the problem, Norma Coates writes about this in her work on rock, and I've really taken this to heart, is that writing about women, she says that writing about women in rock always necessitates taking women out of rock first and then adding them in. So if you say women in rock, you're sort of conceding to rock not having women. Same thing with jazz. If you do, and I have never tried to be a women in jazz scholar, but by writing about women in a field where they're thought not to exist, I'm always in that position of adding women in, while at the same time saying, no, jazz already has women in it. So it's a conundrum that I'm very tired of, and I'm thrilled with this new paradigm, and I think it's going to open up other possibilities. So what are those other possibilities? First I made a slide of talking points, and then I thought, no, they should be listening points. So these are my listening points. These are what I'm thinking about as ways to do the kind of work I do, but do differently and more responsively to jazz and gender justice. So I'm going to listen to the changes, social, musical. I'm going to listen to the changes that affect musicians and their communities. So I'm not just listening, creating a social context for the music I'm studying, or looking at music as kind of a, the thing that's going on at the same time as the historical timeline. But I'm thinking about how Terry Lynn Carrington talks about jazz without patriarchy as this is a great quote. Actually, I think about how to set it up. She said this in a panel. Someone asked her about to say more about jazz without patriarchy, and she said that she said, quote, different information would have been coming to the music if the experiences of the people making it had been balanced. So this is for me a new way of connecting. It's a future-oriented way of connecting social change and musical change. It's that the music would have been different. We don't know what it would sound like because it hasn't happened yet, or it's happened in spurts and moments and place. But historically, I'm not going to be able to go back in history and find that connection, but it's a question I can ask of the history. Is I can study the changes that would have set people out of balance, and I can listen to how historical narratives tip the balance one way or the other. The second point there would be listening to the listeners. Who is listeners? Who is listening? It would be imagining that everyone has a listening history and everyone is sounding and listening in the moment that you are studying them. Listen to them as people who have hopes for the future, and they don't know what's going to happen next. So it's a kind of it's a different approach to history for me because it's not I'm looking to the past, but I'm not looking backwards. I'm still looking forwards, and I'm looking at people in the past as people who are looking forward and listening forward. They don't know what's going to happen next. So listening for everyone talking and listening at once, not just for the solos. I'm taking that directly from Elsa Barkley Brown. I've been using that for a long time, but I'm still, as have others, but I'm thinking about it slightly differently with this forward motion, and it makes me think of different connections I haven't considered before. And then finally, listen again. You know how some albums, and I know that dates me to say the word albums, but there we go. Some albums are different every time you listen to them. So some studies are like that too. So in 2002, so this is like a way long time ago, 20 years ago, I was contracted by the National Park Service to do a research study on New Orleans jazz women. I wrote this really, really long report, and it's online. It's available online as a PDF. But the main thing that I learned from putting it together was how little that I knew about race and gender in the days of very, very early jazz. So, and in New Orleans. So I keep returning to it. It haunts me. It's something I listen to over and over again, and I always hear something new. So I turn to it with these questions that I have about jazz and gender justice. When I started my research on New Orleans jazz women, I began, as I often do, by asking, what's the dominant story? What's the typical narrative about early New Orleans jazz that I know? And that changed really fast. So I would like to maybe back it up if I can figure out how to do that. Okay, yeah, so there we go. So there's the typical story, and these are actually the exact images that are used in Ken Burns' jazz when he talks about early New Orleans jazz. So we have Jelly Roll Morton on the left, and then we have an unnamed sex worker on the right. And this is presented as a nostalgic story. It's presented as quaint and colorful. And I keep, so I turned to that when I first started my research for the New Orleans Jazz National Park. And I tried to, I asked questions of it, because I often find that if that usually a masculinist story is not devoid of gender. It's not devoid of women even. It's but looking at how the story is shaped. So I then, think of the unnamed sex worker. I don't know who she is. I'm sorry. I don't. I wish I knew her name. I don't. But I'm going to continue talking about her as both a figure that is used to represent sort of the background, the context for jazz history, and Jelly Roll Morton. And I'm also going to think of her as a listener. So she's an early jazz listener. The other place that, and then I look for contradictions. I look for, where do women show up as musicians, for example? And the place that I found doing my research was pretty easy to find, was the place where women showed up on the right, were women pianists who played in the New Orleans jazz revivals in places like Preservation Hall. So women pianists who, interestingly enough, are the same generation as Jelly Roll Morton, but who don't show up in that early history. They show up as older women reviving an old music. So I named these stories. I looked, I name the dominant discourse when I locate them. So I talk about the brothel fantasy, and then I talk about the tradition bearers fantasy, and I compare them and think about them. So one woman whose name I don't know is associated with the birth of jazz. She's there, she hears it, she's listening. One woman whose name I learned when I saw her play when I was a tourist in the 80s. I saw her play with the Preservation Hall Band many decades after she became one of the first piano players in a jazz band. Some would say that Emma Barrett, who's on the right there, played jazz as early as 1910. But either way, we don't know very much about either of these women through this pair of stories. So if I'm listening to the listeners, let's see, I want to listen broadly. I want to listen to the listeners of the music. I want to listen to the listeners who are listening at the same time and place, but maybe not in the same clubs. And I want to listen to what struggles are behind the listeners, what struggles condition the information that come to the music, and what terrains of struggle are opening at the time of their listening. So I want to think of everybody in this picture and more as listeners. We have Sweet Emma Barrett, we have Dolly Adams, another woman who played in early jazz and played actually in brothels when she was 13 years old as a member of her uncle Manuel Manetta's band. Jelly Roll Morton, this woman who I do not know the name of, and the members here of the Nickerson School all-woman orchestra. More about them in a minute. Let's see. So I wanted to return to this typical story because I want to think of, we think of Jelly Roll Morton and Emma Barrett, who are contemporaries. They're born around the same time period, although they're playing at different times. If Emma Barrett starts playing professionally around 1910, Jelly Roll Morton has already left New Orleans. But they probably did know each other because they had the same music teacher. I'm going to return here now to the typical story, and this is actually, I don't have the sound on it, but this is actually the footage from Ken Burns Jazz that I was referring to earlier. So I want to talk about who's listening and who's watching. So in this narrative, Jelly Roll Morton is behind that picture on the wall, and he's looking through a peephole, and he's playing while he's watching this woman have sex. And this is told as a quaint, nostalgic story. And if he does something really, really special, she gives him a big tip. And so one of the things that I wanted to think of is, if we're talking about all the listeners, there's at least, if we talk about the players, there's one, Jelly Roll Morton is playing, but if we talk about the listeners in that scene, there are at least 3 listeners. There's Jelly Roll Morton, who's behind the wall watching. There's the woman who's the sex worker. And then there's the person who never gets mentioned, the client. And in Storyville brothels, the only people who were the clients were white men. And so this story, as a dominant narrative, holds together a lot of things that are important to acknowledge and disrupt. So in privileging Morton as the jazz musician who creates the music while watching the woman have sex, we're privileging the desires, not of Jelly Roll Morton, who's enjoying what he sees, according to the Ken Burns jazz clip, but to the desires of the white moneyed man who is tipping well when he hears something he likes. And so the person, the active listener who's shaping the music in this story is a white man who's the only person who's allowed to come in and pay to listen to this music in this place. So as Alicia P. Long and Emily Landau and other historians of Storyville have pointed out, the bordello fantasy, which is very, very typical not only of histories of jazz, but histories of New Orleans, obscures complex and often violent histories of sex, race, poverty, law, and urban planning. There was already a sex industry in New Orleans before Storyville was established in its most famous incarnation. But in 1897, the year after Plessy versus Ferguson, Louisiana, established an ordinance that zoned the women who worked in Storyville into that area. So they not only worked in a tightly zoned area, but they were not allowed to leave the area. And in order to move Storyville so it was out of the way, we have this example of early urban planning where they decided to build it on top of a working class Black neighborhood, displacing schools and a big church and stuff like that. So there's all kinds of reasons not to be nostalgic for this history, but it repeats. Now I want to talk through these other things that are happening in the 1860s, the time 1890s, the time period in which, early jazz, the early jazz musicians are being born. They're starting to, develop ideas. They're developing new ideas. And we have 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson, which is a national case in the United States, but it's also a New Orleans case. It was brought by Homer Plessy to challenge Jim Crow laws as a part of Americanization. So there were different laws about race in New Orleans prior to Americanization, and Americanization of New Orleans is results after many histories of violence, of violent occupations of that city by France, by Spain, and then by the U.S. and in the occupation, the U.S. As part of Americanization, new rules about race bring about this black-white binary, which had been conceived, race had been conceived very differently before that. So all this is to say that after Plessy, and this is a civil rights case that was defeated, that had a disastrous result, makes mandatory segregation constitutional. And it also racially reclassifies people living in New Orleans. I could go back, I can talk about the Haitian Revolution also, maybe I'll save for the Q&A, but even the Americanization of New Orleans is made possible by the Louisiana Purchase, which is made possible because Napoleon is broke after the Haitian Revolution. And the United States, instead of welcoming the Second Republic in the Western Hemisphere, responds by not recognizing Haiti as a nation, refusing to do trade. Haiti ends up having to pay reparations to France. People migrate out of Haiti, and in fact, at the time of that early jazz is being developed, the population had changed quite a lot, and the Haitian migration had doubled the size of New Orleans, and it had quadrupled the population of free people of color. So many jazz musicians, including Jelly Roll Morton, were descendants of the post-Haitian Revolution migration to New Orleans. So there's a lot of Caribbean influence in the music because people are on the move. So when it's told as a story of Americanization, it's not usually Americanization means, oh, it's reflecting the values of America. I mean, in that kind of story. But what to listen to that more deeply, we'd have to listen to the U.S. as part of the transnational histories of war and violence and imperialism, et cetera, that are the context, part of the ground for the new music. Oh boy, I got to get back to my script or I'm going to go too long. So the music, this is not a history that compels nostalgia. In other words, when we think about it, and yet the history of early New Orleans is the cradle of jazz, is the brothels as the cradle of jazz, is part of the dominant narrative. So let's see. All right. So Storyville is tiny. I showed it on the screen there because I want to talk about some other places. But if we listen to everybody talking and listening at once, this is another of my listening points, and this is Elsa Barkley Brown, then I want to listen to all of the people who are playing, who are listening, in all of the places where jazz is played and listening, being played and listened to. But I also want to think about the broader landscape, the soundscape, and what kinds of listening people are doing, and what kinds of sounding are they contributing to, as this that is in the same bandwidth as the music. So I've been thinking about one of the things that the Jazz and Gender Justice Institute has made me think about is how, if I'm thinking about musicians in the early 1900s in New Orleans who are creating new music, people who have been racially reclassified, everybody's racially reclassified after Plessy because it's a complete redefinition of what race means. And so white people are racially reclassified to have certain kinds of privileges, and the people, free people of color who were identified as Creole of color, were racially reclassified as Black. So it's a generation of people whose identities have been racially have been reclassified by the state. Their life chances have been racially reclassified by the state. And so it seems to me that I should also be listening, how is it possible to think about jazz and gender justice in this time and place, is also thinking about the people who are in the city of New Orleans who are creating Confederate monuments in this same time period. And many, many women were involved in the funding and fundraising and celebrations of the Confederate monuments. Most Confederate monuments were not built directly after the Civil War. They were built between 1900 and 1919. So this is a chart that shows that kind of correlates moments of monument building with moments of civil rights struggles. So listening to the changes. I want to read out loud this quote from Angela Davis. What we manage to do each time we win a victory is not so much to secure change once and for all, but rather to create new terrains for struggle. So listening to jazz changes and social changes is interconnected as people move toward or away from something else, as the ground changes, as people move the ground, musically and otherwise, as the ground moves them. This means presuming that these changes are experienced differentially by differently positioned subjects, listening to social change not just as historical context, or but staying attuned to potential interconnections between jazz and the development of a new music, and these shifting terrains, so that it's not about thinking about change as social change as happening only at certain times in history, but thinking of it as happening all the time, and that thinking of victories is not a time that where everything is fine, but this is a tall order, but to think about how does the jazz historian track all of these shifting terrains for struggle. So how did people, maybe not the musicians I'm researching, but people within the same socioeconomic groups and communities, how do they aspire for justice for communities amid the changes of their times? And what is the proximity of jazz playing and listening to the larger social and musical soundscape? We may be asking questions for which we will not find answers, but the questions open the space for social change. When Terry Lynn Carrington and the faculty and the board and students at the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice ask what would jazz sound like without patriarchy, they don't pose it as a question with a knowable answer, but a question with a necessary answer, a question that compels change. So as somebody who researches the jazz past, I can study the imbalances, the changes in imbalance, the movements of those struggling for balance, the effects of imbalance on different players and listeners. I can listen for moments of relative balance. I can insist on listening for forward movement in the people and the music I study, even when the information about them continually positions them as stuck in time and backward facing. This thinking about this has made me really think about Emma Barrett and the women who, I think previously I was like, oh, wow, they're not included as innovators because that's masculine. They're included as tradition bearers because that's feminine. But one thing I hadn't thought about is how it positions them always listening backward to an old music. It never positions them. We never get to hear about what their hopes are when they are playing new music as they did. So I cannot extrapolate how the music would have sounded differently under different conditions, but I can keep that speculative, future-oriented question alive as a practice of race and gender justice. I take that as a given, and I look forward to learning more from the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice for guidance on how listening to the jazz past might contribute. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. I did have a few more things I wanted to talk about. Am I okay?
Yeah, you are. You can go for
okay.
10 more minutes if you want.
10 more. Sure. Okay. All right.
If you need, it's up to you.
Yes. Okay. So I mentioned, I'm glad I get to this because this is quite interesting to me, is that I mentioned that Jelly Roll Morton and Emma Barrett had the same music teacher and most likely knew each other. I wanted to show how close the Nickerson School is to Storyville. So I think the when I was doing research on women in early New Orleans jazz, part of the excitement for me was finding all of the other listening spaces besides Storyville where music was happening and where jazz musicians were. And jazz musicians, they studied with music teachers. You know, most of them were not. I think the popular image of the jazz musician who just plays naturally without training is really part of this problem. And thinking about the teachers is a great way to connect. So Joseph Nickerson started, started his school for, he had private lessons in his home, but he also started a ladies' orchestra, and he was able to start his school around 1913. But he had much earlier, he had lessons in his home, and he started the ladies' orchestra in 1895. And a lot of jazz musicians studied with Nickerson, and a lot of, including Emma Barrett and Jelly Roll Morton. I have recently been thinking about the site of struggle of Black education in New Orleans following in the years leading up to this orchestra and leading up to early jazz, because that's a site of struggle. It's not just, I think sometimes formal training is thought of as outside of social struggle in jazz history, and I think it's really important to remember that Black education had lots and lots and lots of opposition around the time that jazz is becoming a new music, and there are many overlaps. And so the William Nickerson was born in New Orleans in around there's several birth dates for him, but let's just say 1850s, 1860s. So right before or right after the end of the Civil War. In 1866, I mean, right after the Civil War, to give an idea of how violent New Orleans was, and you know, there was a lot of resistance in the South to the North having won the war. 4 school buildings were burnt down in 1866, Black school buildings, and so this is a constant, and it's still. If you think about the present, there's so many threads that continue through. We've recently had many, bomb threats at historically Black colleges, and so that history continues to be with us. Straight University was one of the first. William Nickerson went to Straight University at the same time that he was running his school, and that was the first. I'll skip that, but that was the first of three Black colleges that were started in New Orleans right after the Civil War and before the end of what is called radical Reconstruction. So radical Reconstruction ends in 1877 when the federal troops are pulled out of the South and there's no protection. And the slaveocracy, the people who had been in power during slavery, went back to power throughout the South. And so in that brief window of time, Straight University and two other universities start. Straight University was had medical classes. It had a very good law school. It was open to all races and to women and men. And the law school was particularly good. And William Nickerson, while he was teaching at the Nickerson School, or developing his private lessons that would become the Nickerson School, was going to Straight University. He graduated in 1883, and then he started teaching there. To back up, in 1877, when the federal troops are pulled out of the South, the first location of Straight University was burnt. The main building was burnt and the library was burnt by white vigilantes, and it was rebuilt. So when he goes to Straight University, it's the second location, rebuilt, and he knows this history while he's going there. Everybody knows this history. So he teaches there, and then he becomes after the end of radical Reconstruction. I keep backing up. I'm sorry. Straight University is pressured to become a high school to take Black students who are not going to be allowed at other high schools. So there's just so much going on to listen to at the same time. What difference does it make to know that Rosalind Johnson, who's a student at Straight University, played piano in Storyville brothels because she could make more money than she could playing for theaters? So there's just a lot of listening, ground for listening. The Nickerson taught at during the time that that Emma Barrett was playing. Nickerson taught at I'm sorry, I've lost my notes, but he taught elsewhere, also under duress. He taught at Southern University, where he actually taught on and off for 20 years, but he had to spend about a full year teaching at Southern for no pay because the white people in the neighborhood where that school was wanted it to move. And so the funding was withdrawn and he was teaching for free. So this is just all, the point of this is not like the facts. The facts are backing up this just sort of like directions I'm being pulled for listening, listening for the shifting terrain and the imbalance with which that makes its way into the music. We might not be able to say how and why it does that, but I do take that as I do believe that. I do believe that being less safe, when some people are less safe than others. Will Cheng writes about this in his book, Just Vibrations, The Purpose of Sounding Good, is that when some people are less safe to play than others, when some people, when it's painful for some people to pursue a musical life, and not for others, then that does make it into the music. So I think I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop because I feel like I'm unraveling a little bit. Another place that I'll just leave it here is that another place I found very fruitful for listening to jazz and gender justice is the audio of oral histories, which have recently become available online so that you can listen to them through the Tulane Rising Oral History Project. And so I have been listening to oral histories, and listening to the techniques by which people make themselves heard. And so a very interesting one is between Dolly Adams, who played in Storyville when she was 13, and her interviewer, William Russell, around the same age group. And that this oral history, as do many of the other oral histories from which historians of early New Orleans jazz get their information, were collected while Tulane, which is where the archive that Russell worked for was located, while Tulane was still segregated. And so, in other words, William Russell, while a progressive, was going into Black communities and interviewing Black musicians for their life stories to be housed at an institution that they couldn't attend, that their children couldn't attend. So, and yet the interviews are fascinating because you can hear the aspirational social justice of William Russell, as well as Dolly Adams, as they navigate a way to get the story. She's trying to they're trying to get different stories into the archive. I think that she succeeds, and so that's another place that I've been listening. But I'm going to just stop there. I've been talking an awfully long time, and I'd really love to have dialogue.
Thank you, Sherrie, very much. How about if anyone has questions now, is the moment to share them with us. I would like to pose you a question. How contemporary musicians today do you think they tackle these issues of jazz and gender justice? Do they care about the jazz past, for example?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I mean, I will say that I've noticed in my own institution, the jazz performance students are much more interested in social justice than they used to be. And I think a lot of things account for that. I think that the reckoning with George Floyd's murder had a lot to do with waking people up. And that's when I started noticing in my own classes, which are not in the music department. I teach in American Studies. And I started noticing I was getting more music students coming my way. I've always tried to get them to come my way, but usually I've been told there's just not enough time. It's not enough time. They're practicing all the time. And so, and I will also say that my interactions with the students at the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice at Berkeley has been so invigorating. And I just, it was an experiment really when it started, and students have a choice. They can either do the Jazz and Gender Justice program, or they can just do the regular jazz performance track. And there are a lot of students of all genders, orientations in the Jazz and Gender Justice program who want to do both. I think they're going to change things.
So the kind of studies on jazz and gender of the jazz from the past that would you like to see will be addressed in that direction, right?
They would be what? I'm sorry.
So the kinds of studies on jazz and gender of the jazz from the past would go in that direction. The ones would you
Yes,
like to
yes,
see?
I'm sorry. Yes, definitely. And I think that there's a lot of interest in the jazz past. There's a lot of skepticism about the mis the miseducation that we get about jazz history. And I think it's healthy, very good skepticism. I used to feel like I was doing something that was almost, I don't know, it really bothered people when I first started my work many years ago. I got a lot of pushback that I was disturbing some some stories that people held dear. But I think there's a lot more skepticism now, and a lot more desire to know other stories. What were people doing? What were more people doing? What did people care about?
All right, if there are no more questions or there's nothing else to comment, I would like to thank you for sharing this research with us, these research questions too, that they were very inspirational, and your academic work that is a total privilege. So thank you very much, Sherrie Tucker, Dr. Sherrie Tucker. And we want to remind everyone that next week, next Monday, the 21st of March, Dr. Christy Brown Montesano will talk about classical music and rescuing Carmen from Carmen. So
Fantastic.
we go from rock to jazz, jazz to classical music, then we'll do punk, and then we have Black music. So thank you again, Sherrie, and we'll see you in the cyberspace some other time.
See you in cyberspace. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.